Okay, it's been a long day and I'm about to take a break from the computer, and you can see I'm in the middle of some tense late war games, which are, well, the German line is just about holding, but it's pretty close. But before I finish for the day, what I want to do is record a little bit about D6 probabilities. Do you need to know about D6 probabilities? Well, yes. Hex and counter war games usually use a six-sided die. Not exclusively, but usually. And they usually do it using a combat results table, like the one that's included in Unconditional Surrender. Sometimes you roll a single d6 and look it up on the combat table. Sometimes, as in Unconditional Surrender, both parties roll a d6 and they compare them. Beyond sort of learning the rules, the first tactical thing you need to learn is how do the probabilities work in the game. And this video is going to be about the basics of that. How do d6 probabilities work? How do you calculate them? Only the basics, no Markov chains in this one. Do you need me to cover the basics? Well, try answering this question. You need to roll one success, and I offer you the opportunity to do it by rolling a single die and getting a success on 5+, or rolling 2 dice and getting success on 6. Which one would you choose? If you can answer that question, and you know how to calculate the probabilities, and you know straight off the top of your head what the probabilities for those two particular scenarios are, then you do not need this video. If you don't, then you definitely need what I'm trying to teach in this video. Whether or not this video does a good job of it, that's a different question. But let's begin with the combat results table. And this is something that I mocked up in PowerPoint, and it was literally one of the very first things I did. It's an enlarged version of the combat results table, and superimposed on top of it is a box that I can move around the table to indicate different results. So an attacker +5 against a defender +1. I can hover over this section and I can isolate just the results. And there are 36 of them because one player is rolling a six-sided die and the other is rolling a six-sided die. There will always be 36 possible results for you to look at. And you should have one of these. If I were playing the game in person, I would have one of these. I would make a combat chart, I would laminate it, I would create a cardboard cutout that isolated the results for any particular combat. And you should do the same. And if you're not looking stuff up on the combat table like this, when you think about what's going on, you won't be learning how the combat table works. So you absolutely need one of these. If you have one of these, what you learn is that the combat table is mostly about the absolute difference between the attacker and the defender's dice roll modifiers. So if the attacker has a 2-point advantage or a 3-point or a 4-point advantage in their dice roll modifier, what exactly the modifiers are is always much less important. And there are certain key points. If you are the attacker, do not attack if you have a -2 or less disadvantage. It's essentially suicidal. It is always better to simply combine in more attackers or rearrange to get a better bonus. -2 or less are bad attacks. The number you're looking for as an attacker is a +1. This has several advantages. For the Germans, it means that there's no danger of an attacker attrition result, which the Germans hate. an attacker attrition opens up a possibility for a counterattack because the Allies will take their turn before the Germans get a chance to repair the unit. If you are the Allies, you don't care about that because you always get an opportunity to repair any attrition on attackers before the Germans get their next attack. But a +1 will just about nudge you into the area where you have a chance of disrupting the defender. So again, you want to be in that area. If you can get to a +3, then you create at least a 50% chance of forcing a retreat. Most combats are essentially about stringing together retreats in order to isolate or surround units. So that's worth bearing in mind. If you can get up to a +6, then you get an 11 in 12 chance of a retreat and nearly a 50% chance of a disruption or elimination. So getting up to that +6 level allows you to just punch through the front of an opponent's line. If you are the defender, then it's worth bearing in mind that as long as the attacker's advantage is +2 or less, there is a chance of getting an attacker stopped result. That's really useful at the beginning of a mobile attack. If the other person is attacking with a panzer and they're going to have 8 movement points left after the attack, an attacker stopped result potentially stops 4 more attacks by that panzer. If you can push the relative numbers down to -4, then you eliminate DR results. If you can push them down to -6, you create about a 1 in 3 chance of an attacker attrition. Obviously, the attacker shouldn't be attacking if you've got a chance of pushing the odds down to that, but it's worth knowing. There's also, for the defender, some effect from just the defender's dice roll modifier, their absolute dice roll modifier, not their relative modifier. If the defender can get at least a +4 on their unit, then they eliminate the possibility of a defender eliminated result. If they can get to a +6, they effectively eliminate the possibility of defender disrupt. But the defender eliminate is the really important one. This is a particular thing for the Soviets in 1941, when they're initially facing attacks by the Germans. Also, to some degree, for the French during the invasion of France. The worst thing that can happen is the Germans hit a unit really with the intention of just trying to push it aside with a couple of consecutive attacks to open up a gap. And instead, the unit just explodes and the Germans just rush straight through that gap. It can turn a fragile defensive line into a total catastrophe. So knowing that just layering an air support and a tank counter onto your unit suddenly removes that possibility, that's a handy thing to know. So what I'm going to do today is I'm going to, aside from that general advice on roughly what happens at the combat table, I'm going to talk about some actual scenarios and I'm going to calculate some of the probabilities with you and explain how you do the calculations of essentially the simplest cases. So, scenario 1. We have 2 Soviet units and they're attacking a Finnish unit at Oulu. They're in poor weather, but they have a single tank marker available. Now, in this particular scenario, and in fact in this particular game, if you take Oulu, so you don't need to kill the Finnish unit, just take the city, the Finns will lose their last remaining national will and they will surrender. That's a huge boon to the Soviets. It frees all of the Soviet units on the Finnish front to immediately come back to the main theatre in the USSR. Should the Soviets do this as a single combined attack, or should they attack independently with the 2 units? Well, let's look at the combat results table for the combined attack. Now, you can read off from the combat results table that there's a 12 in 36 chance of the Soviets forcing a retreat. So you can literally read that off from the combat results table. All you have to remember is that because the defender is under a very large penalty, there are 3 rows represented by the first row, so 3 times 3 is 9, plus 2 defender retreats from the next row and 1 defender retreat from the row after that, so there are 12, and there are always 36 possibilities, because it's always 6 by 6. So 12 in 36, 1 in 3 is the chances on a combined assault. Now, let's take a look what happens if one unit goes in on its own with a tank. Now the odds drop to 7 in 36. And if another unit goes in and doesn't even have the tank, well, the odds drop to 3 in 36. So we've got 3 different sets of odds: 12 in 36, 7 in 36, 3 in 36. The first one of those is really easy. It's just the odds of the thing happening. What we need to do to compare it is work out the chance that one of the 2 separate attacks will succeed. Well, this is a very common situation that you encounter in D6 games, and it has a very easy way to solve it. You calculate the chances that you won't succeed. So in this case, 29 in 36 multiplied by 33 in 36. And you subtract that from 1. So instead of calculating the odds that you will succeed, you calculate the odds that you will fail, because probabilities where one thing after another have to happen in a particular order are easy to calculate. You just multiply the probability of each of the individual events together. And here, all you care about is that at least one of the attacks goes in, because that will force the retreat and you will capture Oulu. So you do that. You calculate that it's 957 in 1296. 1296, because that's 36 multiplied by 36. It's the 4th indices of 6. Yes, you should know your 4th indices of 6. You should know your 4th indices of 5. 625, by the way. All of these numbers that I'm calculating, I've obviously written down so that you can see them, but I calculated all of these in my head. You should be able to calculate these kinds of numbers in your head. All of these probabilities are relatively simple. They're 2-digit numbers multiplied together. They're essentially times tables, a bit of disassembly. That's all that's involved. So in this case, the final odds are 339 in 1296. How does that compare to 12 in 36? Well, it's not as good. 360 in 1296 would be 10 in 36. This doesn't even make that mark. And that's actually a really good rule of thumb. 7 plus 3, 7 in 36, and 3 in 36. 7 plus 3 is 10 in 36. Now, there's always a chance that both will succeed, so there's always an overlap. The odds will never be as good as adding the 2 of them together. They will always fall short of that level. So we know that a 7 in 36 and a 3 in 36 is never going to be as good as a 12 in 36 chance. In this case, you should combine the assault. Let's look at another one of these. Here we have 2 German units. They're launching an attack in fair weather, but because of movement, they can only launch 1 attack each. Do they use assaults to combine it, or do they launch 2 consecutive mobile attacks? In this case, my opponent chose to launch 1 combined assault rather than 2 separate ones. And remember, the objective here really is to take that space. They're trying to turn the flank of the units in Kiev and force a retreat of Soviet units from there. Did they make the right call? Again, we'll look at the combined odds on the table. Really easy to count off here. There's a 24 in 36 chance of succeeding. There's a 12 in 36 chance of failing. Then we'll look at the chances of the two attacks independently. Now, they happen to be the same odds in both cases, and they're 17 in 36 of failing, 19 in 36 of succeeding. And I'm sure you can all remember the explanation of the last one. What you do is you take the chance of failure, you multiply the two chances together, and you subtract it from 1, and that gets you your final answer, which is 1007 in 1296. And that's way better than your chances of succeeding on the combined attack, which, remember, were 24 in 36, about 2 in 3. And that's actually, this is one of the cases where it's really obvious, a 19 in 36 chance of success and another 19 in 36 chance of success are going to be better than a 24 in 36 chance. Because while they're not going to be as good as adding the two together, they're not going to be a huge distance short of that. So, and this is generally the case. When you have the option of making two separate attacks, it is usually better odds than when you have the option of making one combined attack. So you're usually better off making two separate attacks than one combined attack. That's almost always the case. However, it does change when your relative advantage drops below +1. And that's what was going on in the other case. But you've now got the tools to work it out for yourself. And more importantly, a really useful rule of thumb. Just add the two probabilities together, and if they are less than the combined probability, you know you want to go with the combined assault. Otherwise, the odds are it's probably the independent assaults that will give you the best odds. Let's have a look at another one of these. I call this one apples and oranges. This is understanding that there are different types of result on the combat table, and therefore you need to compare the probabilities of those different types of results. In this case, severe weather has set in. The German player wants to take Kharkov. Killing the 13th Infantry would be great, but the objective is to take Kharkov. In this case, they launched a combined assault, and the result was that the Russian unit was depleted, and of course it was then just rebuilt at the end of the round because it's in a friendly city, so it's in supply, so it just gets rebuilt. Would you have been better off launching the assault without actually surrounding Kharkov? Let's have a look at this. Here are the odds. Now remember, we're in severe weather, so we're halving the results, which is why we get this smaller box that's only 3 by 4. There's less variety. But there are still 36 possible results because you rolled a d6 and your opponent rolled a d6. In this case, there's only a 2 in 36 chance of getting a defender disrupted. And that's what you need to take the city, because the unit needs to blow up, and that will only happen if it is both disrupted and then takes an additional step loss from having to retreat, which it can't do. Let's compare this with all 3 units attacking independently and leaving open a retreat space. Now you notice the odds get a lot worse very quickly. The reason is the isolation bonus. If the opponent does not have a retreat space and they don't have an adjacent friendly city or an adjacent unit, you get a +2 on your attacks. The isolation bonus makes a big difference. In this case, our odds of success are just 8 in 36. So we're quite likely to fail with any individual attack. What are our odds of at least one of the attacks pushing the Soviet unit out? Remember, we're willing to let the Soviet unit get away if we can take the city. Well, the chances of failing are 28 in 36. So multiply 28 in 36 by 28 in 36 by 28 in 36 again, because there are 3 attacks. Any one of them succeeding will be fine, and subtract that from 1. So you're looking at me going, That's a difficult calculation. No, because 28 in 36 simplifies to 7 in 9. So it's really just 7 in 9 to the power 3. That's 343 and 729, which is about a little under 50%. So that's much better odds than the 2 in 36 we were just looking at. However, there's a slight complication here. Taking the city by destroying the unit is better than taking the city without destroying the unit, because it costs the opponent 3 points of national morale, whereas just taking the city costs the opponent 2 points of national will. So we can use expected results to give us some sense of which option is better. Essentially, we take the odds of destroying the unit and capturing the city and we multiply them by 3, because that's our reward for doing it. And we get to 6 in 36. And we take the odds of forcing the enemy out and we multiply it by 2, because that's our reward for actually taking the city but not killing the unit. And that comes up to actually more than 1. So it's very, very obvious that there's a big gap between one of these and the other. Now, you'll be thinking, there are other options. We could have surrounded the city and then attacked independently with the 3 units. We could have attacked with some combination of 2 and 1 of the units with both scenarios. Yes, we can, but calculating the probabilities on that requires matrices and Markov chains, and that's definitely a lesson for another day. For the moment, there's a valuable tactical lesson here. At certain points in the game, you care more about gaining ground than you do about killing units. When those situations arise, do not waste your time on slim chances of blowing up units when you can instead get a good chance of capturing the ground. We'll do one last scenario and we'll show how you can tease out several different possible scenarios. This is slightly more complicated, but not so advanced that we need additional mathematical tools for it. This is from an actual game, and I definitely did not handle it in the game as well as I could have done. The Soviets want to take Königsberg. This is towards the end of the war. It's enormously important. Königsberg is a factory. If you take it away from the Germans lose 2 production points for the winter every month, and that means that they won't be able to rebuild as effectively to meet the next summer offensive. So taking it's way more valuable than killing the unit. But how do you go about doing that? Should you launch a single combined attack with the shock unit and the guard? Should you launch independent attacks with the shock unit and the guard? Or should you withdraw the guard unit and launch a single attack with the shock unit, leaving a retreat space open so that the Königsberg unit can escape and you can take the city? So 3 possible scenarios. Let's look at the all-out attack. Remember, on an all-out attack, we need a DD result. We're not going to get a second chance. The only way we're going to blow up the unit, because it's in a friendly city, is to get a DD result. And we have a 7 in 36 chance of getting that. Now we look at attacking with just 1 unit and trying to force a retreat. And this is awful. And you're probably looking at me going, why has the odds dropped so dramatically down to 5 in 36 of just getting a retreat when we were running at 7 in 36 of getting a disruption? Well, that's the isolation bonus. We didn't just lose the +1 for the additional unit. We lost the +2 for the isolation bonus. So we shifted 3 whole points down on the combat table. That's the problem here. Now, we can also do the calculations. They're a bit more difficult, of working out what happens if we hit consecutively with 2 units. Essentially, there are 3 scenarios here. The first scenario is we blow up the unit that's defending because we get a DD result. And there's a 2 in 36 chance of that happening. The second scenario is that we deplete the unit by getting a defender retreats, and then we get any bad result for the defender, who's now at a -2, and the defender blows up. So that's 10 in 36 for the initial retreat. Remember, we've already calculated the 2 defender deplete results, so we don't include those in our count. And then it would be 24 in 36 for the chances of a negative result on the next attack. And then there's the possibility that nothing happens on the first attack, but on the second attack we get the defender disrupt and the unit blows up. And I've put those 3 probabilities on the side, and I've converted them all to out of 1296 because that's what the more complicated scenarios are out of. And now you can simply add those probabilities together to tell you what the chances of removing the unit are. And here are our 3 scenarios. A combined assault has a 7 in 36 chance of getting the unit out of Königsberg. Withdrawing units to allow a retreat path and then launching a single attack has a 5 in 36 chance. The double attack has a 360 in 1296 chance. How does that compare? Well, remember, 1296 is 36 times 36. So divide the 360 by 36, and that's 10. In other words, the double attack is by far the best chance of removing the Königsberg unit, which is the thing that you're trying to do. Okay, so here endeth the lesson. So I've given you 4 scenarios, and I've kind of talked through the way that you calculate the probabilities. Here's the important thing to remember. In any situation where one event, then another event, then another event have to happen strictly in that order, you can calculate the probability of that happening by just multiplying each probability together. And that means where you've got multiple possible attacks and any one of them independently succeeding and they're not affected by the others, then you can simply calculate the probability of all of them failing, and that will tell you the probability of at least one of them succeeding. It's by far the most useful kind of probability trick you ever learn for doing stuff like this in your head, because it simplifies what would otherwise be quite complicated calculations. And these make a difference. So in the examples I've just given, the tactical choices that were available shifted the odds by approximately 1 in 12, 1 in 6, 16 in 36, and 5 in 36. If you were making those choices at random, your odds would be shifting about 1 in 10 against you in every single attack. And in the game, you make hundreds of attacks. So a player with a basic knowledge of probability is going to succeed on 20, 30, or 40 attacks in a full main event game that their opponent just won't. And this is all you need to have that effect. I mean, you can learn more about the probability and you will be able to shift the odds even more in your favour, but there's a diminishing returns. You are never going to get as much of a gain as you will get by simply looking things up on the CRT and being able to do basic probability calculations for simple scenarios. So if you're not doing this stuff, if you're not doing these calculations, if you are not checking the CRT, don't ever complain to me about your luck in the game, because it's not bad luck that's killing you. It's a lack of tactical understanding of the central component of this game, which is combats. And like I said, I mean, I've seen some statistical figures because Board Game Arena actually provides you at the end of games with figures for all sorts of different things that happen during the games. And there are hundreds of attacks take place every year in the game. The game runs over 5 or 6 years. Right? You're looking at 500 to 1,000 attack scenarios in any one game. If you know your probabilities better than your opponent, that is going to tip the game in your favour pretty much regardless of anything else. Anyway, right, I've had my little rant about probability. I've introduced some basic concepts. I've probably not done a great job of explaining them. If you want to know more, comment in the comment box and tell me things you didn't understand, or ask additional questions about how I work things out. Or ask if you do in fact want me to do a video at some point on Markov chains and explain how you actually do those. Those you cannot do in your head. So have fun and may all your games be successful.